Hi everyone, my name is Duncan and I'm a PhD student, well, coming to the end of my PhD now, at the University of Kent under the supervision of Professor Nigel Mason. Although for the last 2.5 years or so, I've been based out here in Eastern Hungary at the Atomic Institute for Nuclear Research, where I conduct most of my experimental work. Before I kick off the presentation, I'd just like to say big thanks to Dr. Sohan Jita and all the NorCell team for inviting me to give this presentation. I would have loved to be there with you in St. Andrews, especially since I was a student at St. Andrews not too long ago myself, but hey-ho, maybe next time. Okay, so what I'd like to talk to you all about today, if I may, is radiation chemistry within astrophysical ices and why that is important to study, and perhaps more importantly, how we can study it in the laboratory. And I'll give a bit of an overview of the kind of techniques that we use, but I'd like to use some results from some recent experiments of ours in which we looked at the formation of ozone from the irradiation of CO2 ice as a bit of a case example. Right, okay. So I'll just change this to a pointer. Right, okay. So why should we study the radiation chemistry that occurs in astrophysical ices? Well, when we talk about astrophysical ices, we usually mean those interstellar icy mantles that coat interstellar dust grains. And these are pretty much pervasive in the dense clouds in interstellar space. Now, these dense clouds are sufficiently dense, as their name suggests, that they block out most of the interstellar radiation field from their cores, the result of which is that their cores are very dark, very cold, and pretty much any atomic or molecular material within that core freezes out onto the dust grains. However, the cloud itself is not thick enough or dense enough to actually attenuate any kind of galactic cosmic ray. And so impinging galactic cosmic rays could actually trigger radiation chemistry within the ices. And you can see kind of a cartoony-like diagram on the right there. Now, why is that important? Well, radiation chemistry delivers sufficient energy within the system that otherwise stable chemical bonds are very easily broken. And the radicals and ions formed as a result of these bond-breaking processes can then recombine to form new molecules. Now, in the dense interstellar medium, it's the current theory that when molecules and atoms freeze out onto the grains, it's only fairly simple molecules that form first, things like ammonia and CO, CO2, that kind of thing. But when they are processed by these galactic cosmic rays and radiation regimes, then more complex molecules can form. And laboratory experiments have demonstrated that you can form anything up to and including amino acids, sugars, nuclear bases, these key ingredients to the formation of life. Now, the idea is that as the dense cloud evolves and then creates planetary systems and solar systems, as you can see on the figure to the left there, these molecular feedstocks for life can then be transported and seeded into these planets. And so that's why it's very important that we study them and study them rigorously. Now, I mentioned earlier that when we talk about astrophysical ices, we tend to mean interstellar ices, but most of the techniques and the principles that we consider when we deal with interstellar ices can actually translate to ices within the solar system. Most famously within our field, of course, the Galilean moons of Jupiter are studied, mainly because of the potential that they have to host life in their oceans, but also because their radiation chemistry is very interesting because they all orbit within the giant Jovian magnetosphere. But obviously we can consider other kinds of icy objects in the solar system. The image on the right there, very famous image of Comet 67P that I'm sure you're all aware. But ice radiation chemistry in the solar system also occurs in unexpected places. And what you can see in the image on the bottom left there is the North Pole of Mercury. Mercury being fairly close to the sun, you'd imagine ice is not really stable there, but within permanently shadowed crater regions towards the pole, sunlight doesn't really have that access angle with which it can heat up the environment. And so temperatures are sufficiently cold that ice can accrete within these craters. Okay, so how do we actually go about studying these astrophysical ices and their radiation chemistry in the lab? Well, here in Hungary, we have a custom-built experimental setup with the ice chamber for astrophysics, astrochemistry, which we call ITSA. ITSA is essentially a chamber. You can see a top view schematic diagram here. And this chamber is an ultra high vacuum compatible chamber. We reach base pressures of about 10 to the minus 9 millibars. Within the chamber is a substrate holder that you can see to the right here. Now, this substrate holder is essentially a copper block coated in gold that holds a series of zinc selenide substrates. And I'll mention why it's important that the substrate is zinc selenide in a minute. But what we do is we have a cryostat in contact with this substrate holder, and that allows us to cool down the substrate holder to about 20 Kelvin, although we can regulate the temperature between 20 Kelvin and room temperature. So what we do is once we pump down the chamber, cool down the substrate holder, we can dose gases and vapors into the chamber through a gas inlet system. They're scattered by a distributor plate, and then the gases background deposit onto the substrates. So once they come into contact with the cold substrate, they just condense and form an ice. Now, what we do is we can monitor the formation and processing of these ices in situ using infrared spectroscopy. And that's where it's important to use a zinc selenide substrate disk, because that material is transparent to infrared spectroscopy. And so we can monitor these ices in situ, as I say, using infrared absorption spectroscopy. We can also monitor the gas phase of the chamber using quadrupole mass spectrometry. We have a QMS attached to the side of the chamber. And once we have an ice of a defined chemical composition deposited on our substrate, then the interesting stuff kicks off. We can process it. I've already mentioned we can control the temperature of the substrate and, by extension, the ice by just heating it up and cooling it down. So that's one option. We can do thermal processing. But we can also irradiate the ices with electrons. We have an electron gun kindly donated to us by the University of Miskolc attached to the chamber. But really interestingly is the fact that the chamber itself is hooked up to a tandetron particle accelerator. And so we can irradiate our ices with ions of various elemental identities and energies, protons, carbon ions, sulfur ions, and so on. And so we can mimic the radiation chemistry in various astrophysical environments. So what would a typical experiment look like? Well, if we look at the image on the left-hand side here, what we had done is we deposited a pure methanol ice, which is the black spectrum that you can see here. This is just a standard mid-infrared absorption spectrum. And then we irradiated that methanol ice using 1 mega electron volt protons. And we collected additional spectra throughout the irradiation process, and you can see 3 of them here, increasing in delivered dose from red to blue to cyan. And we can note a few things. Firstly, we can note that the absorption bands attributable to methanol start to decrease in size. That is because the methanol itself is being destroyed and new molecules are being formed. And those molecules bands are becoming more and more prominent as the irradiation process goes on. So we can see that there's CO here, carbon monoxide. Carbon dioxide also very efficiently forms. We get formaldehyde and we get methane. Now, these themselves are not particularly complex molecules, but if we had deposited a more complex ice, for example, a mixture of methanol, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, interesting molecules from the perspective of biology. On the right-hand side, there's the infrared spectra for an experiment in which we irradiated hexagonal crystalline water ice, this black spectrum here, with 2 kilo electron volt electrons. And what you can see most prominently is that the band not only decreases in size, but it radically changes its shape. And what that is, it's evidence of an amorphization process induced by radiation. So these are things that we have to consider when we're talking about radiation chemistry in interstellar and astrophysical ices in general. Chemical changes, amorphization processes, and also compaction process. The ice itself could be quite porous to start out with, but under the influence of ionizing radiation, that will compact fairly quickly. Okay, so on to our case study, which we actually very recently published. Why should we care about ozone chemistry in extraterrestrial environments? Well, we already know from a terrestrial context that ozone is a very important molecular species because it protects the surface of our planet from harmful ultraviolet radiation that is incident on the Earth. But from an astronomical perspective, ozone is actually a fairly useful tracer molecule for molecular oxygen, which is a lot more difficult to observe spectroscopically, mainly because it's infrared inactive. Furthermore, we know that ozone exists on the surfaces of several icy moons within our solar system, Ganymede in the Jovian system and Rhea and Dione in the Saturnian systems to start with. But there is a noticeable absence of ozone in the icy nuclei of comets, despite the fact that we know that oxygen is a fairly abundant element within these comets. Furthermore, we've yet to detect ozone on moons such as Europa or Callisto. So there are quite a few outstanding problems when it comes to ozone radiation chemistry and ozone astrochemistry in general. And so we thought we'd give this a shot. Another reason why it's important to understand ozone chemistry, of course, is that because it's such a powerful oxidant, it could actually itself generate chemical disequilibria, and that could drive prebiotic molecular synthesis. Okay, so what has been done already? Well, the easiest way to form ozone in a radiation experiment is to just simply irradiate molecular oxygen ice. And this was done about 15 years ago by Siverman et al. And what they found is, if we look at the graph on the right here, that the lower the temperature of the process, the more ozone you actually form as a result of the irradiation of oxygen ice. And the reason for this is that as you go to higher temperatures, the oxygen atoms that result from the dissociation of the oxygen molecule recombine to reform that oxygen molecule more efficiently at these higher temperatures. And so by really cooling down the substrate to temperatures that you really would only find in the interstellar medium, you maximize the formation efficiency of ozone, or at least the abundance you get at the end of your radiation. What they also found is that the infrared absorption band of ozone is itself a composite band formed of three distinct features. The largest feature is due to a monomeric ozone molecule, which is what we would have expected anyway. But there are two smaller features shifted to the sides here. And these are due to complexes in the icy matrix. One of them at higher wave numbers due to the ozone-ozone complex, a kind of dimeric structure, and another due to the ozone-oxygen complex. So this is very interesting, and such an insight could actually tell us a bit more about the formation mechanisms and formation chemistry of ozone in these irradiated ices. Okay, so that takes care a little bit of the irradiation of oxygen. What about the irradiation of other oxygen-bearing molecules, carbon dioxide, for example? Well, previous studies really have only focused on the formation of carbon monoxide from irradiated carbon dioxide. This is a very efficient process, and we think it's one of the major processes of contributing carbon monoxide to various icy moons. But in reality, other products also do form, mainly carbon trioxide, note not the carbonate ion, molecular carbon trioxide in this case, and also ozone. Now, this raises an interesting point because carbon dioxide is one of the most prevalent ices in the cosmos. And so we have to ask, is the irradiation of CO2, either in the interstellar medium or on icy moons, a reasonable mechanism by which we can generate ozone ice in these icy astrophysical environments? And the three questions that we wanted to ask in particular were, what is the temperature dependence of this process? We saw previously that there is a temperature dependence in the case of oxygen. Is there something similar in the case of carbon dioxide? Does mixing with O2 ice have any influence on the radiation chemistry at hand? And are there any spectroscopic markers that can give any further information, such as the breakdown of that ozone peak that we saw earlier? So answering the first question, looking into the effect of temperature, you can see on the left-hand side here, this is a series of infrared spectra of the irradiation of pure CO2 ice at different temperatures. And you can see that ozone forms in every single case. However, if we look at this plot here on the right-hand side, this is a plot of the column density, which is a sort of spectroscopic identifier for abundance. The plot of column density against electron fluence as a function of temperature. So these black squares here represent the irradiation process at 20 Kelvin. And what we noticed was that when we raised the irradiation temperature to 30 and 40 Kelvin, the amount of ozone within our ice actually increased rather than decreased, as we would have expected from the oxygen results. Interestingly, however, when we raised it further to 50 Kelvin, it just absolutely tanked. The ozone really didn't efficiently form, I should say. And the reason for this is that at 50 Kelvin, we are now really beyond the sublimation temperature of oxygen. And so the oxygen, the molecular oxygen that's needed to form in order to first give ozone is just sublimating out of the ice rather than forming that ozone. And so we see that, like in the case of the irradiation of molecular oxygen, we have a clear temperature dependence, although it is a very different and very distinct temperature dependence in this case. The second question that we wanted to answer is, what is the effect of mixing with molecular oxygen? And again, if I can just draw your attention to this graph on the right-hand side here, essentially we plotted out the ozone formation efficiency, and we defined that in two ways. I won't go into detail as to how we defined it, just in the interest of time, but if you're interested, our paper is this one here that was published in PTCP. And we see a fairly similar trend, irrespective of whatever definition we use, in that at very high oxygen contents within the ice, we get a fairly efficient ozone formation. That then rapidly decreases until about a quarter of the ice is composed of CO2. It plateaus for a bit, and then beyond about 80% CO2 content, it starts to decline again. Now, we can see that in the spectra, the ozone absorption bands in the infrared spectra of these irradiations. And we can see that the largest peaks are those that contain the most oxygen. And really, once you get down to a pure carbon dioxide ice, which is this black spectrum here, the peak is actually fairly small. So this demonstrates quite nicely that the effect of mixing with O2 actually promotes ozone formation. Now, the last question that we had asked, spectroscopic markers, you'll recall that I mentioned that the ozone band itself is composed of three substructures. Interestingly, we only see three substructures in ices which are very rich in oxygen. When you get past a certain percentage composition of carbon dioxide, you lose the substructure attributable to the ozone atomic oxygen complex. And that is fairly well understood, because atomic oxygen in that case has so many more reaction pathways when a new molecule is introduced that it's just quickly eaten up in the radiation chemistry. However, because we can see that the position of the bands seem to be fairly dependent upon the initial stoichiometric composition of the ice, this actually might be useful for observational work. So if we observe an ozone peak in some kind of astrophysical ice, and we can plot out where the subcomponents lie, it might show what the index is. Of course, this is still a preliminary study, and other mixtures need to be considered as well, but it shows that, yes, this could be quite useful. So that leads us then to answer a slightly awkward question, which is, if ozone formation is so feasible and so efficient, why do we not see any in comets or on some moons? Well, the current running hypothesis is that ozone, because it's such a potent oxidizing molecule, is just eaten up by other molecules that are oxidized in the process. And the prime candidate for this is sulfur dioxide. We know sulfur dioxide is ubiquitous in the Galilean moon system, mainly because of volcanism on Io. And we know that sulfur molecules are also fairly common in the icy nuclei of comets. And what Loeffler and Hudson at NASA did was they simply mixed ozone and SO2 ice, raised it to a sort of temperature that's relevant to Europa or Ganymede or the other icy moons, and just plotted out the decay of ozone. And they found that this decay is fairly efficient. And so this is the current best idea that we have why ozone is not found in comets and moons. So I can see that I'm just about to run out of time here. So just to conclude very quickly, ozone is a very important molecule from both an interstellar medium and a planetary science perspective, mainly because of its role in atmospheric systems and its potent oxidative nature. We've shown through our experiments that ozone is very efficiently formed as a result of the radiation chemistry of oxygen-bearing ices, mainly oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that the abundance of oxygen within the ice actually contributes to greater ozone formation efficiencies. We also have some preliminary evidence that the position of the various ozone subcomponents contributes greatly to the, or rather is very strongly dependent upon the initial composition of the ice. And so that might be useful for future JWST missions or any of the slew of missions that are going to be launched towards the Jovian system in the next 2 or 3 years. And finally, it does show us that we need to really try and constrain the formation efficiencies from other mixtures and see what other kind of chemistry ozone can participate in. And so that just leaves me now to say thank you all for listening to me, and to thank the absolutely wonderful team that we have built up from from a variety of different institutions. And I will just say that here at Atomiki, we're always looking for new collaborations and new partners. So if you think that radiation chemistry of ices could be useful to your research, please get in touch. We're always, we're a friendly bunch. We're always happy to collaborate. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.